Yeah, so the Buddhist tradition comes out of that sort of, in a sense, that Upanishadic sort of ideal. So when the Buddha is born into the world, he's born into the Kshatriya class, a sort of warrior ruling class, said to be sort of a small kingdom in what is today southern Nepal. And he essentially, for the first 30 years, according to the narrative of his life, is sort of a prince living the luxurious life. At some point, he encounters one of these ascetics, one of these people who's seeking escape from this endless cycle of existence, what is known as samsara. He encounters one of these figures and says, that's what I want to try to pursue. So in terms of symbolism in the narrative of the Buddha, the fact that he had the most ideal, luxurious life and renounces it is significant, right? That didn't lead him full satisfaction. So at any rate, he sort of renounces that. He goes and follows this ascetic path, one that's sort of outlined in the Upanishads, studies under 2 gurus in the forest, masters their yogic techniques, is able to achieve these high sort of transcendent states of consciousness and so forth, but ultimately finds that wanting. So he basically sort of decides, and he actually gets to the point, according to that tradition, that he is living on 1 grain of rice a day. So that ascetic ideal was, in a sense, to sort of deny the body and identify only with this spiritual, eternal essence within. And he realized that he was probably going to die on this path, so he stopped it. So in the end, he is somewhat critical of that extreme, but he borrows a lot from those basic sort of ideals. So the idea of samsara, this endless cycle of existence, of this quest to somehow escape from this endless cycle, all of that gets appropriated into the Buddhist tradition. So in terms of Buddhism, he ultimately realizes an enlightenment, and his realization is sort of encapsulated in what are known as the 4 Noble Truths. It's said that once he achieved this enlightenment, he encountered these comrades that he had known before, and he basically gave this first sermon that was the essence of his realization in this enlightenment experience. The first noble truth, that all life is suffering. The second is the cause of suffering. The third is the way out of suffering. And the fourth is how you get there. So essentially, it's interesting because he's sometimes called Dr. Buddha, because he's diagnosing, in a sense, the human problem and the way to overcome it. So the first is the cause of suffering is like the sickness. The first is suffering, which is the sickness. The second is the cause of suffering. The third is what it looks like to be well, and that is known as nirvana, this realization. And the fourth is the Eightfold Path, which is how you get there. And so when Buddhism is talking about the fundamental human problem as one of suffering, that's often misunderstood in the West in significant ways. A better translation of the term they use, which is dukkha, a better translation is something like dissatisfactoriness or discontent. And as I sort of tell my students, from a Buddhist perspective, if you can imagine the most joyful moments in your life, when you fall in love, when you get married, when you have a child, when you achieve some goal long pursued, if you examine yourself closely in those moments of joy, you will sort of admit that there is some measure of fear in those moments, that this person may reject me, this marriage may not last, this child may die, right. There is some awareness that this may not last forever. From a Buddhist perspective, that is dukkha. So it's not denying that there are joyful moments in life, but it is saying that even in those moments, there is some measure of discontent. And when I sort of try to put Buddhism in the most kind of basic, mundane terms, it is the basic premise about Buddhism, about the nature of reality, is that everything is impermanent. Nothing stays the same. So there is nothing that is eternal. So Buddhism, from the beginning, is denying this notion of Brahman, this ultimate reality that is eternal and unchanging. It is denying this notion of an Atman, some eternal essence within, right? There is nothing that is that is permanent or unchanging. And the problem is that we tend to sort of grasp and attach to things thinking they're going to give us some kind of lasting happiness, and inevitably they will change. So that could be, attaching to our own bodies, attaching to our own sort of truth claims and ideas, attaching to material objects, attaching to personal attainments, et cetera, et cetera. That what Buddhism will say is that ultimately things will change and you will experience loss. And so that is sort of a measure of, it's kind of a sort of an aspect of this kind of universal nature of suffering. And at the kind of deepest level, it is this attachment to yourself as some independent, autonomous, sort of eternal thing. So that at the deepest level, this attachment to this kind of egotistical way of being in the world. That one ultimately has to understand that we're really more like processes that are kind of moving. And that if we understand that, if this is kind of requires deep practice and so forth, if we understand that, we're less likely to sort of cling to things and possessions and people and even this notion of I. So if we can diminish our sort of egotistical tendencies, then we will suffer less, according to Buddhism. And ultimately, one can realize what they consider nirvana, which is escape from this cycle of samsara altogether.